today's session, we're going to go over some covered buildings list updates, bill updates, and then jump into workshop summary and open forum. There are no more workshops coming up, so that's good. And then we'll do additional Q&A. I'm hoping today's session can be a breakdown of kind of best practices that go along with some of these higher level topics. In addition, I'm hoping that it can be a semi-open forum style workshop where feel free to chime in at any time. I'd love to talk to any of you about where you are in the process. If you have specific questions about some of the places you've run into and or some of the topics we're chatting about today, I'd love to talk further about those. So feel free, no need to wait until the end to the Q&A. Unless you want to, can hop on in and we can chat about anything during the time we're talking about it during this session. So today just had a few updates from the covered buildings list since last session. We currently have a version 2 on the Colorado Energy Office website. So feel free to access that there. There will be another version coming shortly with some additional updates to remove a few buildings who aren't necessarily subject and hopefully include some missing data. There will be another version somewhere down the line that will include all of the missing data. Essentially, we've just been waiting on a few things, which, not to spoil it, we'll go to the next slide, to the journey of this bill, which has trucked along the way to being officially passed on June 8th. So now that the bill has passed, we do have some leeway there to get a bit more information from local tax assessors regarding buildings in the areas that potentially have missing buildings for now. There were a few jurisdictions we couldn't get those from initially. So good news all around and hopefully good things to come, because that next version of the covered buildings list will come down the line. And this is our last workshop. I will still send out a notice to you all, whoever is signed up for the group, to receive either the correspondences or to attend or both. I'll send out an email notice letting you know that that version has been replaced online and you can access that there. Jumping on into things today, starting with an overview here. Wanted to run us quickly through some of the topics that we've talked about in the past, and just to give us a better picture of where we're going, I wanted to start with the benchmarking process again from an owner's perspective. Each year, an owner is going to have to report to the state their whole building energy usage through an online benchmarking tool. So just knowing that an owner needs to get this whole building information, depending on their building's orientation, it might be difficult for them to get that without your assistance. And then also knowing that it has to be submitted online through an online benchmarking tool, most usually Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which has a specific spreadsheet in which owners can easily upload information into their benchmarking portal in order to send it off to the state. So utility needs on that side, given what owners are required to do on an annual basis, whether you're a qualifying utility or not based on bill definitions, you must provide whole building energy information in an aggregated format upon request, and then be able to manage those consent, privacy, and request forms. So utility needs, I wanted to extrapolate on a bit further. So essentially digging into what utilities must provide there that we just chatted about in terms of the whole building aggregated data upon request and managing those consent and privacy forms. When it comes to aggregating whole building data, there are a couple things involved. You need to aggregate the data, first of all. Sometimes you might not. If there's only one owner in the building, they're the main occupant, and or maybe there's one tenant and the owner has a good relationship, they can get that info from them. You may not need to be involved in this process, but potentially there's a need for you to be able to aggregate the information on owner's request. So essentially there's some things that come into play here, but ultimately they're all connected. So essentially, in order to aggregate the data, you may need a consent or authorization form to be submitted. And then within that, you'll need to set an aggregation threshold to determine whether the request that comes in that you're managing is able to be fulfilled without additional consent needs from tenants or occupants at that building. So digging into the whole building aggregated data upon request a bit further, diving in specifically to the aggregated data piece. Since the bill has passed, I wanted to pull out some definitions from the bill in regards to this portion. So essentially the bill defines aggregated data as electric or gas meter data from which any unique identifier or personal information has been removed, and that a qualifying utility collects and aggregates in at least monthly intervals for an entire covered building. So it does mention qualified utility here, which from previous iterations, non-qualifying was technically removed as a definition from the bill. However, those utilities still fall under these requirements in terms of being able to provide aggregated data to an owner upon their request. It's just not necessarily dictated in which specific way. So if you think about this aggregated data in terms of just a generic definition, when you're providing it, you want to make sure that there's no personal information or identifiers in there that someone could gather or gain any information about a tenant's usage. When it comes to unique identifier, a piece from the aggregated data definition, it's really just breaking that down a bit further to clarify that means a customer's name, their address, their number, email, typical things you would assume we wouldn't want to be disclosing in any way. So essentially what you're providing the owner is a lump sum of their energy usage, where they can't identify who's using what from any portion of the building. It's just going to be the whole building's use that they can then report on to the state. In terms of the qualifying utility requirements outlined in the bill regarding this aggregated data, it has to be requested through a specific format. So essentially the bill dictates that for a qualifying utility, they have to have an easily navigable web portal or an online request form with up-to-date security standards in order to take these requests in for data. In addition, the data has to be provided within 90 days of that request for this first year, and then next year, following year, since this kicks in next year, it'll go down to 30 days after that request. The aggregated data must also be either uploaded directly into their benchmarking tool or provided in an applicable spreadsheet like the EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager created spreadsheet, which can be easily uploaded into the tool and allow for that data to populate with no issue and really quick for the owner. In addition, this information must be provided on an annual basis until the owner revokes the request. You can increase the frequency here. You could provide this data on a monthly basis if that was possible through an auto upload format you've set up. But ideally, it's just on an annual basis before their reporting deadline, ideally at the start of the reporting period, so that they can get their report in and comply sooner than later. In addition to the data that an owner needs to request, there are also other pieces of this report that could go wrong. So essentially, the piece of having 90 days to get this data to customers initially is great on a utility side, but it might not be so great on a customer side. In terms of reporting, typically the process includes some quality checks, and there are a lot of things that could go wrong in the report outside of data. So the sooner an owner can get their report into the state for those initial checks and then potential revisions and resubmissions, the better. So when it comes to non-qualifying information here, it's essentially the same. Just because the bill doesn't specify anything doesn't mean that those things won't exist for a non-qualifying utility when an owner reaches out and requests this data. It just breaks down a little differently in terms of actual requirements. So a non-qualifying utility must be able to provide that data request to an owner for them to submit through any route possible for this organization. Generally, an online form would be the easiest, but depending on capabilities, there might be other ways where you want to take requests through email or phone call. I would just caution you that there has to be some sort of way of managing these, keeping these on record somewhere, and potentially there's a path of least resistance for your team. So consider that when thinking into the best route, even though there isn't one specifically laid out for you. In addition, like qualifying, you'll have in the first year 90 days to provide the data to the owner, and then subsequent years it'll go down to the 30-day delivery point. In addition, you can deliver this to customers in whatever format you find necessary or that works for you. Best practices in our recommendation would be to try to aggregate and fit the information into the EPA's spreadsheet that can be easily uploaded into the benchmarking tool, just to prevent owners from having to come to you multiple times or work back and forth with you on additional items. This really streamlines their data process for them, allows them to get this information into their report within, a few minutes. So it's instant once they upload that. It's really just navigating to the place to upload and finding that file to import it there. So really quick process if you get this information to them in that spreadsheet format. In addition, this should come to owners on at least an annual basis or until they revoke that request. Likewise with a qualifying utility, the owners reach out to you for this information, and this requirement on their end for reporting to the state is annual. So you do want to make sure you're able to get this information to them each year before they need to report. So in addition to those requirements that are stated in the bill and or not stated in the bill, there are some best practices here and recommendations for you all in terms of how to provide this aggregated data. And essentially, in order to provide it, you need to take some initial steps to get to the point of giving it to the customer. So best practices for starting this would be to assess and document your internal systems. Essentially, you want to interpret and define your data to determine the starting point. What system you have, what capabilities do you have, what internal record keeping requirements do you have? Are there any additional items here that might come into play and might influence the way you go about this aggregation process initially? In addition, when you're going through this interpreting and definition standpoint, you want to document what you're doing in an attempt to create some internal policies and process flows that'll allow for this to run smoothly on a corporate organization, whole utility company basis. So essentially, you'd want to determine how your organization currently handles data requests, if at all. You may need to create a new policy for that entirely. So it would be a combination of using what you've interpreted and what you have as a current system to essentially define the best route for managing and handling those data requests. You want to discuss aggregation thresholds during this time. We're going to touch on this in a few slides, but I think it was worth mentioning here as a part of this process. It is tied throughout, so we'll jump back to that, but essentially we want to know during this initial process flow and internal policy creation step when and how your data aggregation threshold will be applied. And the whole point of doing this is to avoid any ambiguities that may stem from this overall process. As it is new, you may be hearing from customers who also are probably going through this for the first time. If we could get a mute on everybody, that would be great. To make sure that there are no shortfalls, everything's documented properly, everyone knows what's going on, there's an understanding throughout. So it can work from top to bottom, working from the customer service side of things to the actual data aggregation and data disbursement process. So next point that you want to address in this data aggregation process is how to actually aggregate the data. When someone reaches out and requests data from, say, a handful of addresses, how do you go about using your system to aggregate that data and provide it back? So essentially, you want to find a way that works for your company to map your energy meters to buildings. You want to find a point that doesn't pivot, that you could use to essentially determine the best way to aggregate meter and meter data together to then present that back to an owner. Typically, this is going to fall into that internal systems dive where you're looking into what you have going on and what your capabilities are, and essentially also wanting to develop a process that's well known throughout on how this is accomplished upon request. But a few options here for potentially accomplishing this would be to run queries in your customer system to identify service points, energy meters, other customer accounts that might be tied to an individual building. You could also match customer account information with external data sets, physical addresses, or if you have the option, could use a data GIS system in order to match meters specifically to a geolocation, which then could be used as a way of determining if multiple accounts should be compiled together upon request. Ultimately, this is going to have some interaction, some reliance on the building contact. they'll need to provide information in order to initiate this through their data request. And then also they'll probably need to validate the results in terms of ensuring the data you've provided is whole building. Ideally, they're giving you all the information that you need in order to do this initially, but potentially it's lacking. So we'll chat further about some additional ways and best practices for this type of step in which we can get the information from the customer at the beginning, as opposed to, after we've done this process once for them and they come back saying they need something different. So in terms of the aggregation threshold, which is how you'll be essentially determining whether a request requires additional consent from tenants. So you may hear from owners who have multiple tenants, multiple customers, people who are occupying additional space in the building. Potentially the owner doesn't have access to these bills. These tenants, or whoever's occupying the space, however you want to refer to them, are paying for their own usage. The owner has no access to this without your assistance. So essentially setting up an aggregation threshold is an understood and overarching way to ensure that there is privacy considerations when you're pulling together energy use data to ensure no one's compromised. So aggregation threshold in the bill is defined by the minimum number of customer accounts associated with a covered building, which the qualifying utility may provide the owner for the covered building with aggregated data upon request without requiring consent. So summing it up a little bit more digestibly, essentially an aggregation threshold tells you the limit of customers that are required in order for you to just aggregate that data with no question. Any building who doesn't meet the limit would require to get consent from each of those tenants in order for you to aggregate that data. And generally this falls into play when there are less than 4 tenants. And we'll dig into best practices and aggregation thresholds in a slide here, but essentially it's just ensuring that there's privacy across the board. There isn't any risk of someone identifying someone's usage without their consent, because there's so few accounts being aggregated together, may be possible to determine who is using what. Utility customer, in terms of a definition, which relates back to this aggregation threshold definition, is essentially the building owner or tenant that's listed on the utilities record as the customer that pays for the bills. So essentially, if there are other occupants in a building that pay their own usage outside of the owner, they would fall into a definition of utility customer. The owner would as well if they do pay some bills at this property. So best practices in this realm for managing consent and privacy authorization involve the data aggregation threshold. So essentially, as the Venn diagram showed us a few slides back, these two things are very much intertwined. So you can't really have a consent process if you don't have an aggregation threshold. You can, but you'd be probably taking in an unnecessary amount of consent forms. So this is a way to make sure there isn't unnecessary work on anybody's end and also ensure privacy considerations are upheld. So essentially, it's meant to safeguard customer confidentiality as well as to ensure that you're safeguarded too in terms of the information you're compiling together and providing back. Typically, we see utilities adopt a 450 rule for their aggregation threshold. The 4 refers to the minimum number of occupants in the building that would allow for aggregation to happen without consent. There were 4 tenants at the building, could aggregate that information and pass it back. If there were 3 or less under this rule, you'd want to get consent from all of them in order to aggregate that data and provide it back to the owner to report. The 50% comes into play and is, in fact, a rather optional qualification here. So this would be the extent to which you could implement an aggregation threshold to include both portions of this rule. So the 50% portion applies to any one occupant, any one utility customer who is using 50% or more of the total building's consumption. So if that's the case, even if there were a bunch of tenants, so essentially they didn't meet, they surpassed the 4, they wouldn't have had to get consent there, but maybe one of those tenants is using 50% or more, just an excessive amount compared to the rest, then that tenant would need to provide consent in order to get the data aggregated and pass back to the owner. So for this process, typical standard consent forms can be used. Again, it's up to you slightly on how you want to make this happen, but again, managing these consent forms and ensuring they're all in one place is a good practice, potentially doing it through some online secure form in order to just streamline that for you and the team and making sure everything's kind of in one place. No one has to do any manual storage there for those items. Might be a good route. So again, just to define tenant even further, the bill defines tenant as a person pursuant to a rental lease agreement that occupies or holds possession of a building or part of building or premise. So essentially this could come across in a variety of ways, but tenants exist throughout commercial and residential properties. So you can't really determine which situations you may run into tenants more so than others. Ideally, you can kind of assume when it comes to multifamily properties, you'll need to be dealing with some level of consent potentially, but depending on the size of the residential property, you may not. It may come down to more commercial properties, depending. There are less tenant spaces being occupied in commercial properties than multifamily properties. You may find this more on a commercial side, but it's really just going to come down to your territory and what kind of buildings occupy the greatest percentage of your customer base. So it also comes down to the payment of bills. Sometimes the owner pays all the bills of the building and they wouldn't need to reach out for you to aggregate those. Maybe they sub-meter and bill back to tenants. This would then only apply to tenants who pay their own usage, where the owner does not have access to those bills and cannot view that information without your help. In addition to the updated requirements in the bill for qualifying utilities, there were some changes to the consent requirements. So essentially, in terms of just breaking down how that consent can be required to be received for qualifying utilities. So essentially, it can be written in an electronic form that's a secure form, could be provided in a lease agreement provision, which applies to an owner side of things. It is valid until the customer revokes it. And it's not required if a utility customer vacates the covered building before explicitly denying the owner's request. So essentially, there are a handful of things that come into play here you'd want to consider when creating this threshold, and then how it applies and where you're going to apply it. So because they're connected in so many ways, best practice for this would be to set an aggregation threshold and determine the process for how and where it will apply in the process here. So essentially, you may want to consider in the initial data request, asking owners to provide you with the list of tenants, which might break down into the form of additional addresses associated with the property and or maybe number of tenants at the property, some sort of way of giving you an idea of whether or not consent would be triggered during your aggregation process. Initially, owners may not provide this information without being prompted to, so it might be a good way for you to ensure there's less back and forth if you reach out, or just in terms of the general request process for data, it is asked, how many additional tenants are at this building, or are there any other service addresses that we should be including in your data aggregation. So essentially, once you've gotten through those main portions, you've figured out the route you can take in terms of where your system is at, what data you're working with, what your consent form management policies will be, when the aggregation threshold is going to trigger, and when you're going to consider those pieces to ask an owner to provide additional consent to complete the aggregation process. Once you have the data, it's aggregated, all of those things have been accomplished, you're going to need to get it into a format to provide it to the owner or the customer who's requested. So essentially, again, we have these range of options in terms of providing this data to the requester. Spreadsheet would be your most basic option. You'd want to fit it into the specific benchmarking tools spreadsheet. Typically, that's the Energy Star Portfolio Manager spreadsheet that is available on the CEO website right now to download that. And we chatted about this a bit back, but you do need, if you are providing a customer with electric as well as gas data, you do need to provide that information in two separate spreadsheets. So you'd want to have all the electric data in one spreadsheet, and all the gas data in another spreadsheet, same spreadsheet format, just because the units are different and the owner is going to be importing that data into a specific virtual meter, which would designate either their electric data and or their gas data. Of course, the differing units there would be the main reason for that, so they can report those energy sources separate respectively. The other option is auto upload. This would be through the EPA web services. There is ideally coming an EPA technical follow-up to that web services session we had back a few workshops ago. So if there was a need for additional information, or if anybody's looking for additional information on the auto upload section there, please let us know. I can definitely include you in that follow-up technical workshop. The auto upload is a great option for the qualifying utilities. It also might be an option for non-qualifying utilities. Essentially, this allows for you to directly upload information into the requester's benchmarking tool, which generally is going to be Portfolio Manager in this case. So that connection will establish essentially an ongoing stream of data from you to the customer. It also provides back information from the customer to you that can help aid with energy efficiency programs, targeted marketing, essentially ways in which you can get something back from the customer while also giving them the information they need to comply. The final option here and the most robust would be the customer interface. And this essentially is like a portal that a customer could log into to view their bills. You could take this process as extensive as you wanted, or this could be the option where they could have a full stop shop, view their bills, request their data, manage their connections, cancel their requests. You really have a lot of options if you want to go that customer interface route. So essentially, once you have the data, you need to get it in the hands of the customer. So to provide that, you'll choose one of these three options as the most typical and best routes to go for providing that data in an easy way to the customer. In terms of bill information regarding providing data, there was an update to the timeline for implementing all requirements, including providing data to a customer. Essentially, the utility now, instead of having to complete these requirements by January 1st, they must complete these requirements on or before June 1st. All utilities then have 90 days this first year in 2022 to provide that data back to customers. After that, 2023 and on, they'll have 30 days in order to provide that data upon customer request. Ideally, most customers will have their data from you in the first year, and it's kind of just that ongoing process of continuing to provide it. Essentially, if someone does reach out in 2023 or later, you just have a shorter time frame to provide that data to them, which I think ideally at that point you'll have the game plan down, the routine down, and you'll be able to do that with no problem. In addition, that also improves your customer service too, and we'll touch on that in a little bit. So essentially, some of you may need to, in order to accomplish the rest of these items we've just chatted about, make some updates to your system. So essentially, if that is required in terms of most likely qualifying utilities, best practices regarding data system updates and reducing the administrative burden there would be to assign a dedicated lead. Starting this project right out of the gates, you should assign a person who is going to spearhead things. They're going to be in charge of basically pulling together the group from utility-wide organizations and pieces, customer service, IT, whoever needs to be involved and wants to be a part of the conversation. Ideally, it's a group effort, but someone needs to be in charge to make sure things are kind of going the right way. Ideally, they're going to be spearheading the internal efforts and potentially have some sort of understanding of benchmarking already. If not, no problem. But if they do, that definitely aids the process and can help things move along quicker. In addition, you want to create some internal policies to allow for process understanding and a company-wide understanding of kind of how to pursue, proceed, take requests, and move forward. So addressing things like ensuring you have the proper spreadsheet format, ensuring you know what route you're going to take, and kind of how things are going to fall in terms of process from request to getting the data into a customer's hand. In addition to these things and reducing the administrative burden, you want to make sure you have some built-in items that can help your customer. So be it a dedicated web page where maybe there's a user guide, concise steps that can help the owner understand how they can work with you to get the information they need to do this. Potentially also a customer user guide with best practices for working with you to get data and or what you need from them in order to get them the data can also help cut back on the amount of time and administrative need dealing with customers reaching out for this information. In addition to reducing the administrative burden, you may also want to reduce the initial investment. So essentially some options for reducing the initial investment tie closely with that planning step. Essentially, if you do enough digging, information sorting, and trying to find the best route of least resistance that works for you guys, basing it off of current systems, current practices, not needing to reinvent the wheel, just seeing what you're missing and working off of your current capabilities is really the best route here. There's nothing too huge that needs to get done. It's more just trying to make what you have work in a way that fulfills the requirements outlined in the bill if you are a qualifying utility, and or just essentially accomplishes aggregating data and providing that to a customer in either case, whether you're qualifying or non-qualifying. To do this too, it's important to weigh options. So internally, that working group can work together to discuss the potential for system upgrades to happen in-house and or potentially whether you may want to outsource some of these upgrades, what the upgrades might be. The need for those upgrades is also something you want to consider. And in addition, the route you plan on taking. If you do want to go a customer interface route, or if you do want to implement web services to go the auto upload route, potentially different pathways will open up depending on the route you choose. And some may be a little bit more heavy-handed than others, just depending on where you want to go. So rely on that internal working group to basically pull in key members from each department to assess where your starting point is and what the best pathway to then pursue from there would be. With all things considered, I'd say expect to pivot. There's one thing that kind of always happens in this process is it's really just a learning thing as you come along and develop new routes. You might realize you went the spreadsheet route thinking it would be easier, but actually that causes more administrative stress than you were anticipating. Maybe the extra haul or the extra time or a little bit extra investment in web services might just be a better quality of life for the organization overall. So expect after you see how things are work in practice, expect to pivot. No need to feel bad about pivoting. It happens, and as things come to light in terms of what you may have expected to work, maybe it doesn't. So essentially with all that in mind, there certainly could be a financial investment required in order to do some system updates and or implement the pathway that you decide would be best for your organization, whether or not it's required by you under the bill or just something you feel like would be a benefit for your organization to have and provide to customers. So essentially there are some options in terms of covering the initial costs of any investments that might be required. You could use some discretionary funds from your standard operating budget. You could use IT project budget if you decide to do this internally. Potentially you could redirect some of those funds to this project. You could also potentially rely on marketing or customer service budget. This bill down the line will include energy efficiency type requirements. Those will be determined in this most recent iteration. It's been decided those will be determined by a task force down the line. So what those are exactly is unclear, but given they will be energy efficiency upgrades, it could impact or have a positive influence on your energy efficiency programs. So you may be able to cut back on your marketing there, just knowing people may be reaching out to you for those things moving forward down the line. Also, you could use it in the same way as those efficiency program expenditures, have those recovered if that is an option for you. So just some things to consider in terms of potential ways. There may be other ways that are unique to your organization where you could cover and or bypass some of these initial investment costs. So essentially swinging back around to the customer service side of things. Now all things considered in terms of getting the information and providing it, the customer comes into play because they only have a short window to report. It is nice that we do have a little bit more leeway with the first year in terms of that 90-day timeline to get information to an owner upon request. However, the owner does have a short window that's not much longer than that 90 days in order to report. Like I said previously, there are quality checks that do happen on the report outside of energy usage that may impact an owner's ability to comply. So essentially on their first submission, it may not go straight into compliance. They may need to work on some things, make some edits or changes in order to resubmit and comply. So the utility data is a big piece. It's really basically the only requirement an owner oftentimes can't get on their own, and they rely on you to provide. So it is nice to have that 90 days, but just know that if we are pushing that window, really taking that full 90 days to disperse information to an owner, you may see increased customer service needs during that time. Essentially, these owners too may be unfamiliar with the whole benchmarking process. Most of them are eager to comply as soon as possible. And a lot of them don't understand the needs from the utility side in terms of getting them their data, what it's taking in terms of, you working with them to aggregate all their usage, get all the information they need. To them, they don't see that background. They don't know how long or what you're doing back there. To them, they want their data, they need their data, they want it as soon as possible. So while we do have the 90 days, considering the impact it might be on your customer service team or your administrators, hearing from some of these customers, it might be worth trying to even initially find a way to do it a bit quicker. You do have that window. So ultimately, if that's what you need, you have it, that's allowable for the first year. But just considering the customer's perspective on this and potentially their lack of understanding in terms of what's happening on the back end there when they just need their data to submit, they're in the short window that they have to comply before being subject to penalties. So best practice here would be to provide a user guide, create some sort of dedicated web page, maybe have someone dedicated, maybe it's the initial lead of this project, to answering incoming calls or emails, someone who can just temper expectations. Potentially you provide those expectations on your website in terms of you'll have your data 90 days after the request. Maybe offer an option for expediting a request. Everyone might choose that if you do, but just considering the customer's perspective on this, while it doesn't necessarily impact the route you're going to take, it may impact the increased volume you see depending on how many customers are requesting this information from you, just depending on their expectations, their desires, and their timeline. If they do wait until maybe the month before, you just want to be sure you can get them the information they need before they're going to be missing the deadline and subject to penalties. They might get a little unruly. So just some things to consider there in terms of that timeline piece when you are providing data. But essentially, you have a lot of routes you can go. Even on the qualifying utilities side, you're really not locked into too many requirements. And it does allow you to basically make the decisions based on your internal systems currently and your internal processes. So ideally, you don't have to do anything too drastic or reinvent the wheel in a way, that upheaves everything you're already doing currently. So with that said, we do have some additional resources on that system side of things. Again, as a reminder, same from last month, that any interested parties should reach out to Kim, who would be looking into a potential RFP or even RFQ, ideally to identify a list of service providers that might be available to provide any update system, web services, online portal, benchmarking type things for your organization, depending on which route you decide to go. In addition to that, the EPA is always available for web services help. Essentially, anything considering all questions you might have, if you just want to chat about the possibilities there, don't hesitate to reach out to them. They're great, very helpful, and know the system clearly the best as it is their own. So definitely rely on some of these things. I am also here as well if you do have any further questions, data system related or not. So definitely let us know you're not alone here. Reach out if you need the assistance or questions that you need. But ideally, we can answer them today for you too. So moving into Q&A, I'd love to hear from you all. Just see what your thoughts are if you have any questions on today's topics or anything I didn't mention. And feel free to throw any questions in the chat or you can just unmute. More than happy to have you chime in.
Hey, Jess, I just wanted to, this is Kirk from Fort Collins, just wanted to chime in a little bit on the slides regarding the data aggregation and setting internal policies around data aggregation. I think those are pretty critical steps. You know, we did not adopt the 50% rule primarily because of the technical functionality of our IT and our ability to kind of review the 50% rule. I know that's a PUC kind of standard, but the percentages of consumption we steered away from just in terms of the technical capacity of our our internal IT support. So if I was going to go back and tell my younger self how to make my life easier, I would definitely look at your own technical capabilities and then set policies based on what your kind of IT can realistically do.
Great, thank you. That's a very helpful point. Information to your past self is always welcomed here. Kirk is running the Fort Collins benchmarking program, as well as Fort Collins Utilities, and they just went through this process creating their system very recently. So that's definitely good insight for the group. Thank you, Kirk. Any other questions on starting points? Has anyone started in on this project yet? Questions on where you're at or maybe where to pivot from?
Jessica, this is Joel.
Hey, Joel.
I can share that I've started through the process. I was up pretty late last night trying to do a data map between the addresses provided in your spreadsheet and our internal systems. I guess one thing that I would note that I'm seeing is differences in how addresses are noted. Like it might be, road might be abbreviated RD in one system and spelled out in a different one, or there might be a direction associated with a street that makes it difficult to data map. And in some cases, these are really large buildings, so I'm seeing the street number might be different, which is a little bit complicated. So for example, if it takes up 10 acres or something like that, it might be 18304 in one system and 17500 in a different system. So those are the types of data quirks that I'm working through. I'd say I'm about 75% of the way through, but the difficult part will be cities that we don't provide service to the entire city if we only provide a portion. So we'll have to go through the entire list for the entire city and try and identify whether or not we actually provide service to that building and match up the addresses somehow. So this can be complex, but thought I'd share that feedback for you.
Thank you for sharing. Yes, that is a good.
Hey, Joel. Yeah. Joel, I know you worked with us up here up here in the Platte River Valley, but I don't know if your system has this or not, but we use address IDs through our, operations, through our light and power operations. And those are associated to the meters. And so, we don't even try to match those street addresses because they're all spelled differently and inputted all wonky. But luckily our GIS team assigned what we call an address ID, and I'm curious if y'all have tried that.
We have something similar. So we don't have an address ID from the state. All we have is a parcel number and a street address. So we still have to do that side of the map. On our side, we do have something like an address ID. We call it the service location. And we're going to use that. And where that's really going to come in handy is when there are multiple meters at one address, we can roll those up to the address ID or the service location. So that's going to be helpful because I was looking at an apartment building and that turns one address into at least 50 different meters. So that it adds to the list greatly, but being able to roll it up to an address ID or service location, I agree, is going to be key to the next step.
Yeah, and in our next iteration, we're trying to map those. Well, we've mapped we have an address ID, and then we do service delivery points, and then what our next kind of effort is, and this is a little bit more manual, is matching those service delivery points, address IDs, premise numbers to the actual building ID that's been provided by the state, so that when somebody submits their request for data, they'll just submit their building ID through the program, and then we'll already have a kind of filtered premise list associated with that. So then we don't have to ask the customer for a list of addresses or ask the customer for them to identify the services, because we'll just have a pick list on that already.
That is a great idea. Thanks, Kirk. I'm going to do the same thing because I think you're right. A lot of times the building owner is not the same as the account owner. They might rent out the building. So the building owner is not going to have an account number to log in or anything like that. You're right. They'll need the state account number.
Yeah, and we're just trying to, limit the conflict, because we always hear from building owners, well, I don't know, I don't pay the bill. And so they just want to do the report. So if they just give us a building ID, then it just kind of limits the back and forth and just kind of makes that transaction a little bit quicker.
Great, thank you. Very helpful a conversation that you guys have just had. I really appreciate the feedback there, because it's true there are a lot of moving parts when it comes to that meter mapping step. In addition to address numbers changing, road being spelled out or not spelled out, when you have those bigger buildings, they may be on different cross streets as well. So they may have addresses in seemingly different locations, but it's for the same building. So definitely a lot of moving parts there, along with the owner not potentially having an account number themselves can complicate things. So finding one of those pivot points that doesn't change, like with the account number, building number, whichever number you use internally in your system to essentially classify a building or an account that may be at a building, would be the best place to pivot around. It's not going to change, with tenant swaps, ownership changes, things like that. So definitely great information there. Thank you both. Let's see, Laura here says that they've successfully geocoded all of the addresses using the ESRI's World Service geocoding tool in ArcGIS Pro. They were also able to clip them to their territory boundary. Congratulations, Laura. That's awesome. That's a really great route. Definitely helpful in terms of identifying and meter mapping there. The ability to use that geolocation system is really huge, can help a lot too with maybe even universal building IDs if the state gets there at some point. So that's a really awesome way to do that. Thanks for sharing. That's great news. Great. All right. Well, unless anybody has anything else on their mind, I think we'll wrap up today's session. This is the last workshop in the series, and I want to thank everybody who attended, as well as any of our guest speakers who might be attending today's session or might not be. They were all very much appreciated throughout this series. Again, definitely reach out if you have additional questions. There will be upcoming resources and webinars outside of this workshop series that could be helpful to you, and I will definitely pass along more information as I know it so you can attend those and get some additional assistance there. But again, anything you need, we're here for you, so don't hesitate to reach back out. And I appreciate everybody's involvement in this process here. It was good to have you all. So I hope you all enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon.